Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a topic that's close to my heart, learner autonomy.
Ooh, learner autonomy.
Taking charge of your own learning journey. And I have to say, the research you sent over is fascinating. So much to unpack.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. It really flips the script, doesn't it? Puts the learner in the driver's seat.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to learn on their own terms. But before we go too deep, maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly is learner autonomy?
Well, that's the thing, right? Even the experts have been wrestling with that definition for ages.
Ah.
But the core idea is pretty straightforward. It's the ability to take charge of your own learning.
Mm-hmm.
But it's evolved over time. It's become about how you learn and why you learn, not just what you learn.
Right. So it's more than just saying, I'm going to ditch the classroom and learn on my own.
Exactly. It's more nuanced than that. It's
Yep.
about recognizing that we all learn differently, that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
I like that. A custom-tailored learning experience.
Yeah, it really challenges us to think outside the traditional classroom box, to explore different ways to make learning meaningful.
Makes sense. So we've got this idea that learners can have more control, but where did this whole concept of learner autonomy even come from?
Well, it goes back a ways, actually, to the 1970s. Guys like Henri Holek in France,
Hmm.
New Dam in Denmark,
Okay.
they were really pioneers, experimenting with new ways of teaching languages, ways that gave students more choices, more responsibility.
So it's been kind of a two-pronged development then, inside the classroom and outside?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Two paths running parallel, sometimes crossing over, but always moving towards that idea of empowering the learner.
Okay, interesting.
And outside the classroom, we started seeing these self-access language learning centers popping up.
Those are cool. I love those.
Right, they're like these treasure troves of resources, letting learners pick and choose what they want to learn and how they want to learn it.
And then there was the whole rise of language advising.
Oh yeah, that too. Experts guiding learners, helping them set goals and personalize their learning plans.
So a real movement towards self-directed learning. But what about inside the classroom? How did things start to change there?
Well, there were some really interesting developments, things like the process syllabus or the negotiated syllabus,
Okay.
challenging that traditional idea of a fixed curriculum. With the process syllabus, learners actually get to help shape what they learn and how they learn it.
Sounds pretty radical for the time.
It was. And then the negotiated syllabus takes it a step further. Teachers and learners working together, collaborating to create a learning plan that works for everyone.
So it becomes more of a partnership then, rather than the teacher dictating everything.
Exactly. And as English started becoming this global language, the conversation around learner autonomy broadened even more. It went beyond just those classrooms and self-access centers.
Right, because the context changes everything, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The question became, how does this idea of learner autonomy fit into a world where English is being learned in so many different contexts, so many different cultures?
That's a huge question. I mean, as English spread across the globe, so did this idea of learner autonomy.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, right? Can a concept that emerged in the West truly be universally applied?
It's a valid point. And, some researchers started to push back a bit. They were worried that we were maybe imposing a Western model of learning on cultures with different traditions, different beliefs about education.
Right, trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah. You have to be careful about assuming that one size fits all. But I do think there's a difference between the principles of learner autonomy, empowering learners with choice and ownership, and how those principles get put into practice.
Well, it's not about rejecting learner autonomy altogether. It's more about being sensitive to those cultural differences, adapting our approach as needed.
Exactly. Think of it like building a house.
Yeah,
The core idea is the same everywhere, a place of shelter and comfort.
right.
But how that house is built, the materials they use, the style, that's going to vary depending on the climate, the resources available, the culture of the people who live there.
Makes sense. So the same blueprint doesn't work for every house, just like the same approach to learner autonomy won't work for every learner.
Exactly. And even within a single culture, we all have these unique identities, right? Shaped by our experiences, our beliefs, the languages we speak.
Right, and learning a new language, especially a global language like English, it can really impact our sense of self, can it?
Absolutely. It's not just about learning vocabulary and grammar. It's like stepping into a different pair of shoes, experiencing the world from a new perspective. And it can even change how you see yourself.
That's a great analogy. It's like trying on a new outfit. You might discover a whole new side of yourself.
Exactly. And as you become more proficient in that new language, you might start to develop what researchers call an ideal L2 self.
An ideal L2 self. I'll say that's
It's like this image you have of yourself as a confident, fluent speaker of that language. And that image can be super motivating, pushing you to learn and improve.
It's like saying, hey, if I can master this language, I can unlock all these new possibilities. It can be a real confidence booster.
For sure. And with the rise of English as a lingua franca, the language people use to communicate when they don't share a native language. And with all this computer-mediated communication, the focus has really shifted from just learning a language to actually using it in real-world situations.
So it's less about passing tests and more about being able to actually communicate, build relationships, navigate a world that's becoming more and more interconnected.
Exactly. It's about finding your voice, sharing your ideas, connecting with people from all walks of life.
That's powerful. But hold on a sec. We've been talking about learner autonomy as if it's the standalone concept, separate from teaching methods.
Right.
But how does it actually fit into broader pedagogical frameworks? I mean, is there a way to teach for autonomy?
You hit the nail on the head. There's actually a whole field dedicated to just that, pedagogy for autonomy.
Interesting. So it's not just about throwing learners in the deep end and saying, swim.
No, not at all. It's about creating an environment where learners can thrive. And there are different approaches, of course. Some people favor a more, how do I put it, a more weak approach, where you explicitly teach those autonomy skills and strategies.
So like teaching someone to ride a bike by holding onto the seat until they find their balance.
Exactly. But then there's the strong approach, where the focus is on creating an environment that just naturally fosters autonomy.
More like letting go of the bike and encouraging the learner to find their own balance.
Right. But it's not just weak versus strong either. There's also this distinction between narrow and broad interpretations of pedagogy for autonomy. A narrow approach, you're talking about things like, specific study skills, how to use a dictionary, how to manage your time, that sort of thing.
Okay, so very practical tips.
Yeah, exactly. But a broader approach, that's about getting learners to really take ownership of their goals, their strategies, their overall progress. It's about empowering them to make choices that align with, their own needs and aspirations.
So it's like a spectrum. Some educators are going to be more hands-on, some more hands-off. Depends on their beliefs, the context. Lots to consider.
Absolutely. And, even with all these different approaches and perspectives, there are still some big debates around learner autonomy that just keep popping up.
So it's not all smooth sailing in the world of learner autonomy. There are still some rough waters to navigate.
You could say that. And, those debates, they're important. They keep us thinking, keep us pushing the boundaries, keep us refining our approaches.
I like that. So what are some of these big, thorny issues? What are the things that keep the experts up at night?
Well, let's start with a question that's been at the heart of the learner autonomy discussion for decades. Do autonomous learners still need teachers?
That's a good one. I mean, if the whole point is for learners to be self-sufficient, wouldn't that make teachers kind of obsolete?
Well, some people might see it that way. But the reality is, it's more complicated than that, especially when you're talking about adults learning a language. It's not as simple as just picking it up through exposure like we do with our first language.
Right. There's a lot going on in our brains when we try to learn a new language as adults.
Exactly. There are all these complex cognitive processes involved, and research suggests that explicit instruction, that teacher guidance, can be really valuable.
So even the most autonomous learner could benefit from a little bit of scaffolding, a little support to navigate those trickier parts of language learning.
Exactly. It's like having a map and compass, even if you're the one charting your own course.
Okay, I'm with you.
Think about a mountain climber, someone really experienced. They might be able to climb that mountain on their own, but they still benefit from having the right equipment, a good map, maybe even a guide who knows the terrain.
Right. They're not just going to wander off into the wilderness with no preparation.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance, recognizing that autonomous learners don't have to go it completely alone.
And this brings up another point, doesn't it? If we want to foster learner autonomy, shouldn't teachers themselves be autonomous in their professional development, in their decision-making?
100%. It's a two-way street. Autonomous teachers create environments where learner autonomy can thrive. They model the behaviors, the mindset. But there's a potential pitfall here, too. There's a concern that this push for learner autonomy, it could be used as an excuse to, cut costs.
Oh, I see. Reduce the number of teachers, reduce their role, all in the name of efficiency.
Exactly. And that could really be detrimental to learners. In fact, Phil Benson, the researcher, he's pointed this out. He worries that some institutions might jump on the learner autonomy bandwagon as a way to, reduce their reliance on teachers.
So it's a delicate balance then. We need to value teachers, their role in nurturing autonomy, while also empowering learners to take charge.
Right. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. And speaking of balancing acts, the next big debate we need to address is the relationship between assessment and autonomy. How do you square that circle? The need for evaluation with the, very individualized nature of autonomous learning.
That's where things get really interesting. Because traditional assessment systems, they tend to favor standardized tests, right? Convergent outcomes. Everyone's measured against the same yardstick.
Right, everyone doing the same multiple choice tests, filling in the same bubbles. But that doesn't really align with the whole idea of learners forging their own paths, does it?
Nope, not really. And some people argue that these high-stakes standardized tests, they actually hinder autonomy because teachers feel pressured to teach to the test. Narrow the scope of learning, limit opportunities for student choice.
Right, so the assessment ends up dictating what happens in the classroom. The tail wags the dog, as they say.
Exactly. But, not all assessments are created equal. Some research suggests that even within a system like IELTS, which is pretty standardized.
Yeah, IELTS, the big one for English proficiency.
Right. Even there's still room for learners to exercise some autonomy in how they prepare for the exam. Taking ownership of their goals, their strategies, their mindset.
So even in a system that seems pretty rigid, there are still cracks where autonomy can flourish.
Exactly. And then you have frameworks like the EFAR, the Common European Framework of Reference, and the ELP, the European Language Portfolio.
Okay.
These are seen as more conducive to autonomy because they emphasize self-assessment. And they look at a broader range of skills. It's not just about getting a single score on a standardized test.
Right, so it's a more holistic view of what it means to be proficient in a language.
Exactly. And within the field of learner autonomy, there's a strong preference for what's called formative assessment, where assessment is integrated into the learning process. Giving learners ongoing feedback that they can use to adjust their strategies, make choices about their next steps.
So it's more about guiding the learning process rather than just slapping a grade on it at the end.
Right. And then there's self-assessment, peer assessment, where learners are actively involved in evaluating their own progress, giving feedback to each other.
It's a whole different mindset, isn't it? Shifting from assessment of learning to assessment for learning. It becomes a tool for growth, for empowerment.
Exactly. And this leads to another question that researchers are wrestling with. Should we assess learner autonomy itself?
Whoa, that's a tricky one. How do you measure something as complex and multifaceted as autonomy? Wouldn't the very act of assessing it kind of undermine the whole thing?
It's a valid concern, for sure. But there is a growing body of research exploring ways to assess learner autonomy, but not as a judgment, not as a good or bad thing, more as a diagnostic tool, a way to help learners understand their strengths and areas for growth.
So more like a mirror reflecting back to the learner, hey, here's how you're doing on your journey toward greater autonomy, not a pass-fail kind of thing.
Right. And there are different approaches, of course. Some researchers have developed questionnaires where learners can self-assess their autonomy across different dimensions. Technical skills, psychological factors, social and cultural influences, even philosophical beliefs about learning.
Okay.
And others are proposing more qualitative assessment models, looking at that dynamic interplay of all the skills and competencies that contribute to learner autonomy.
So it's about capturing the uniqueness of each learner's journey rather than trying to squeeze everyone into the same box.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final and maybe our most contentious debate about learner autonomy. This idea that it's too focused on the individual, that it ignores the social context of learning.
Right, that every learner for themselves mentality. But learning, especially language learning, is often a very social activity, isn't it? We learn from each other, we practice with each other, we use language to connect with each other.
Right. And that's led to a real shift in thinking, people recognizing that autonomy doesn't have to mean isolation, that it can actually be deeply intertwined with social interaction, with collaboration.
So it's not an either-or proposition. It's more about recognizing that we can be autonomous individuals within a supportive, interconnected learning community.
Exactly. Think of it like a team of mountain climbers. Each climber has their own strengths and challenges, their own pace, their own style, but they're all working together towards that same goal, supporting each other along the way.
I like
Uh,
that. It's that sense of shared purpose, that collective energy that can really propel us forward, can't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, how do we reconcile these seemingly opposing views? How do we balance the individual and the social dimensions of learner autonomy? Well, one way to think about it is this idea of a social individual dialectic in learning. Rebecca Oxford, the researcher, she talks about this. It's like these two forces, they're not really opposites. They're more like in constant interplay, you
So they
know?
need each other.
Exactly. We need that individual drive to set goals, make choices, take charge. But we also need that support, that feedback, those different perspectives that come from interacting with others.
We need both the I and the we.
Right. And that dance between the two, it can look different for everyone. Some learners are naturally going to seek out more collaboration. Others, they might prefer to, fly solo for a while.
Right. It's about finding what works for you. And this makes me think about the role of technology, right? It's like it's blown the doors wide open, both for individual learning and for global connection.
Oh, yeah, it's totally changed the game. Think about it. You got language learning apps that give you personalized feedback, online communities where you can practice with people from all over the world, even virtual reality experiences that can like immerse you in different cultures.
It's amazing. But it can also be a bit overwhelming, can it? So much information, so many resources. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes.
That's true. And that's why it's so important to, equip learners with those critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just teach them the language. We need to help them evaluate information, figure out what's credible, make good choices about what they learn and how they learn it.
Give them that compass and map so they don't get lost in the digital jungle.
Exactly. And that's where educators, teachers, mentors, facilitators, our role becomes even more important.
So the classroom's not dead, but it's definitely evolving. It's becoming more about creating that supportive space for exploration, for discovery.
For sure. And you know what's really fascinating? Neuroscience. All this research on how the brain works, it's giving us all these new insights into learning, including learner autonomy.
Oh, neuroscience. That's a whole other deep dive. But how does it relate to learner autonomy?
Well, for one thing, it's starting to challenge some of our assumptions about free will, about how much control we really have over our own learning. So much of what we do is driven by unconscious processes. How much autonomy is actually possible?
Whoa, that's a big question. Gets into some pretty deep philosophical territory there.
It does. But even if we don't have, complete conscious control over every single thing our brains do, we still have this incredible capacity for choice, for agency.
So it's not a black and white thing. It's not either we're completely autonomous or we're just puppets on a string.
Right. Think of it like this. Your genes, they might predispose you to certain talents, certain learning styles, but they don't determine your destiny. Your environment, your experiences, the choices you make, they all play a role in shaping who you become as a learner.
So we're not just along for the ride. We actually have some say in where we end up.
Exactly. And one of the coolest things that neuroscience has shown us is this concept of neuroplasticity. Our brains, they're not fixed. They can change. They can rewire themselves throughout our lives.
So even if our brains aren't blank slates, they're not set in stone either.
Right. And that's good news for learners of all ages.
That's really encouraging. It means you're not stuck with whatever learning challenges you might have faced in the past. You can learn new skills, develop new strategies, even overcome those challenges with effort and practice.
Exactly. And that's, really at the heart of learner autonomy. Recognizing your strengths, your challenges, embracing your individuality as a learner, finding what works best for you.
Taking ownership of your learning journey, charting your own course.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much ground, haven't we? The history, the definitions, the challenges, the possibilities.
It really has been. And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to, take more control of their own learning, to explore what learner autonomy means for them.
Me too. So as we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. If learner autonomy is about taking the reins, what's one small step you can take today to move in that direction?
Maybe it's setting a specific learning goal, checking out a new online resource, or even just, taking a few minutes to reflect on your learning habits. Figure out what's working, what's not working, and see if there's one small tweak you can make.
Yeah, just one small change can make a big difference over time. And remember, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's all about finding what works for you.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of learner autonomy. Until next time, happy learning.